Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, the show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm Graham, and today I'm talking with Ben Kelly, one of Britain's most distinctive and enduring designers. Ben is best known for designing the Hacienda, the Factory Records-owned nightclub in Manchester that defined an era. But his portfolio goes well beyond that. Work with Sex Pistols, Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren, the V&A, the Science Museum, Gymbox. He's been present at some of the most interesting moments in British culture over the last 50 years, and the spaces he's made for those moments still resonate. Here's Ben on how he approaches a space.
I'm interested in the context of the space. I'm interested in geometry and the plan. And the plan is the key thing to me. Is it a boring rectangle? Has it got funny angles? And I like this idea of the thing called palimpsest, where you scrape away and you find something behind it, and it reveals something else and something else. You strip it right back to its bare bones to find out its history. And you maybe want to work with what you find. You maybe want to get rid of what you find.
Hi, Cadley. Good to have you here.
Hi, Graham. So tell me how your conversation with Ben was.
Yeah, the conversation with Ben was amazing. I grew up on Factory Records, the sleeves, the whole aesthetic that Peter Saville was building. So sitting down with Ben and knowing he was working in that same world was a conversation I'd really been looking forward to. We talked about his upbringing in rural Yorkshire and how distance from design culture shaped the way he sees things. We got into the full story behind the Hacienda, of course, the industrial aesthetic, where his trademark International Orange came from. He talked about Virgil Abloh, referencing his work, and he names the one space in the world he wishes he'd designed, and I was genuinely surprised by that answer.
Tell me about how Ben's design inspired some of your own interior design when you were younger.
Oh, no. Okay. Well, this is a funny story and I'll try and keep it short. Before I went to university, I was kind of at a crossroads, really. I knew I wanted to do something creative. I was interested in graphic design, as I've just mentioned, but also interior design. And I was very inspired by the interior of the Hacienda, which Ben designed, so much so that I redesigned the interior of my bedroom at my mum's house to mimic the Hacienda. I took the colour palette of the Hacienda. I used industrial materials. I tore up the carpet. And bless her, my mum let me do it. I thought it looked amazing. I don't have any photographic evidence of it, sadly. It was pre-smartphones. But my sister will testify it was great. And I am so happy that my mum let me do it.
It's quite a full circle moment from designing your college bedroom to speaking with the inspiration on this podcast episode now.
I just want to add one thing about Ben, which really stood out for me in the conversation. There's a passage where he talks about designing things to last rather than to be fashionable. Coming from someone whose work from 1982 is now listed by Historic England, it's not an abstract idea either. He's really earned the right to say that.
Well, I'm excited for our listeners to hear from you and Ben. Thanks for hosting, Graham. With that, we'll turn it over to you and Ben.
Welcome to Creative Characters by Monotype. Today we have Ben Kelly with us. Ben Kelly graduated from the Royal College of Art in 1974 and has spent the 5 decades since designing spaces that people don't forget. He's designed for Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren, worked with the Sex Pistols, and in 1982 turned a former yacht showroom in Manchester into the Hacienda, a club Historic England now lists as one of the 100 places that tell the story of England. Designers from Raf Simons to Virgil Abloh have cited him as a direct influence, and his work sits in the permanent collections of the V&A and the British Council. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you.
It's great to have you on the podcast. Now, I've got so many questions I want to ask you. Firstly, I wanted to also talk a little bit up front about an event that you had with C Design.
What can I tell you? It's called One Thing Leads to Another. which is what tends to happen. Working with Brian at sea has been pretty great. We've ended up with a bit of a theme, which is kind of to do with perforations, strangely or not. There is a kind of narrative there whereby one thing leads to another. So the narrative of what we're showing there, I guess it starts with the cover to my so-called thesis as a student at the Royal College in my last year there, which I titled Metal-Lined Cubicles by the Photo Kid. The cover was produced on an A4 sheet of mild steel with some machine-etched letters saying Metal-Lined Cubicles, the Photo Kid. I left this outside to rust, and it became the cover of my thesis. And the thing about the rust is that rust works its way through metal and eventually would leave a hole, and it could leave a load of perforations. But one day, a friend of mine called Peter Saville saw this piece of work and liked it a lot, and he borrowed it. It kind of turned into the sleeve for the single by Joy Division, Love Will Tear Us Apart. I met Peter in a private members club called the Zanzibar, which was a kind of happening place at the time, sometime in the late 70s. And he told me that he had the job to design a record sleeve for a band called Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. Peter had recently moved to London. OMD had signed to an offshoot of Virgin called Din Disc, having had their first single out on Factory Records, where Peter had been a founding partner. And Peter told me that he had this idea for a record sleeve, but really didn't know how to kind of turn it into reality. It was a kind of conceptual idea. And this is my interpretation and the way that my memory tells me. I could have it slightly wrong, but the idea was to make a record sleeve using the least amount of cardboard possible, an album cover. And I kind of immediately thought, I know exactly what it should be. And I told Peter he should go down Longacre in Covent Garden to look at the front of a shop that I had designed a few years earlier, the first built project that I ever did. And I had put perforated steel panels behind the glass panels of the entrance door into the shop. I said it should be a perforated sleeve. And he had a look, and we had a meeting shortly after that where I took along the catalogue from the company that made the perforations in the steel panels on the door of the shop, a company called APW, Associated Perforators and Weavers. I was interested in process at the time. So the process of perforating a record sleeve seemed interesting to me, and Peter was taken with the idea. I think because it was Din Disc and they were a new record label, this is what went ahead. And we kind of designed this thing together, and it went on and it won awards. And I then designed kind of a touring set for the band OMD, which had these perforated panels in this fairly simple structure that they could take on tour. So it became a kind of an identifying image for the band somehow or other, but it had not been seen on a record sleeve before. And if you pulled the inner sleeve out, you could see through the perforations of the outer sleeve. And we made it from contrasting colours. The inner sleeve was a bright orange, and the outer sleeve was a kind of a fairly vibrant blue with a sticker on it saying Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. And I'd never designed a record sleeve before. And I thought, this is great, let's do some more. And that led on to a kind of an amazing relationship that I had with Peter over the years.
I wanted to pick up on something you just said. So you mentioned the nickname or alter ego that you had back at Royal College of Art, the Photo Kid, and you still use that as your handle on Instagram. I wanted to understand what relevance it still has for you today.
Okay, well, that kind of goes back to the first week that I arrived in London as a student to go to the Royal College. I wandered down the King's Road and stumbled upon a store called Let It Rock, which was run by Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood. And it was an amazing place. I'd never seen anything like it before. And they were kind of selling teddy boy gear, crepe sole shoes, brothel creepers, and it had a 1950s jukebox in there playing rock and roll stuff. Vivienne was in there with kind of peroxide spiky blonde hair, looking pretty damned amazing. Malcolm was usually in a kind of zoot suit, a fairly loud character. But I kind of fell in love with that place, and I started to buy things from that shop and changed my whole image. I was very disappointed when I got to Royal College. I thought everybody was going to look like David Hockney with peroxide blonde hair and gold lame suits, which he wore at his degree show. But no, they were just looked like regular, boring people. And I was disappointed. I wanted excitement. Oh, the other thing, I had long hair at the time, and I went straight back home and cut all my hair off with a pair of scissors as a kind of reaction against what I saw. People still had long hair there, and it just wasn't groovy and hip as far as I was concerned. I wanted to look different. And I kind of dressed like that most of the time, and people started taking photographs of me. I realized that there was something to use. I worked with a friend of mine who was a photographer, and we go to certain locations and take pictures of me out on location. And I think I'd been reading Hunter S. Thompson's book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, where Ralph Steadman did illustrations of this kind of crazy journey that Hunter Thompson was going on. And I liked the idea of taking myself to different locations. We went out to Heathrow Airport one time, and as if I was going off to some glamorous destination, and took pictures of me out there, just different places in and around London. And one day, another friend who was a student pointed at me and said, "He's the photo kid. You're the photo kid." I thought, fine, I'll take that. Fast forward to the digital world, and when mobile phones appeared and something called Instagram, which I knew nothing about, and I was at somebody's house and they said, "Oh, you need to be on Instagram." I said, "Well, I have no idea." So they just grabbed my phone and set it up and said, "What's your name?" I said, "Oh, the photo kid." And it's kind of remained that ever since. It's sort of my alter ego. But it seemed appropriate to me that if you're taking hundreds of photos and you're putting them on this thing called Instagram, it might well be taken by the photo kid.
I love that clarification in a way, because I didn't know that you were actually the subject, and that's why you were the photo kid. So I just assumed it was that you took lots of photos.
Yeah, I do, but I am also the photo kid. And I'm not really Ben either. I was christened David. So I've had various kind of iterations of who and what I am and what people call me, which I find quite entertaining.
So let's dive into identity, your own identity, a little bit on that kind of tack. So you've said you leave it to others to define your identity. And there's a well-known line about rescuing your signature colour, International Orange, from the scrap heap of style that is apparently going on your gravestone.
What happened there was I got the job to design a hairdressing salon on the King's Road, one shop away from Malcolm and Vivian's store. It was called Smile, and Smile had started life in Knightsbridge, and they were kind of the hippest, grooviest hairdressers in town at the time. And I remember that when Roxy Music appeared on the scene in 1971, that's where the band went, and that's where they kind of got styled. I became friendly with particularly Keith, who was one of the proprietors of Smile, and they bought the building on the King's Road next to Malcolm and Vivian's store, and asked me to design the hairdressing salon. My brief to myself was to design a hairdressing salon that looked as least like a hairdressing salon as possible, because they'd kind of become cliched, and either they were kind of run-of-the-mill, bosh, sort of identikit places, or they aspired to glamour and to be upmarket, and I thought it could be something else. And I used the colour orange on that job, which kind of was not fashionable at the time. And a magazine decided to publish the job. I think it might have been the World of Interiors. And when the stylist came along for the photographer to take pictures, she brought along some oranges and put them in the hairdressing positions, the styling positions. A journalist wrote the piece up and pronounced, "Ben Kelly rescued the colour orange from the scrap heap of style." And I thought, I'll have that, thank you very much. I was quite serious about that some colours go in and out of fashion. And orange, I think, had been quite fashionable in the 50s, possibly early 60s, and was not fashionable when I did the Smile job. And they go in and out of fashion, but some have stigmas attached to them. Some is really difficult to use. Purple's another one, until Prince came along. I did another job using the colour orange and built a bit of a reputation for using that colour, which it was more to do with an art statement in a sense. It was kind of, this is what I'm doing. I don't give a damn what anybody else thinks or is doing. And if it's not fashionable, I'll either make it fashionable or keep it unfashionable willfully. And yeah, the joke about putting it on my headstone, well, why not? I don't know. Well, let's see what happens.
So let me dive in a little bit about your work. I like that thing you said about almost turning a category code or something in terms of the expectation of a hairdressing salon, for instance, into something completely unexpected. And I think some of that is possibly to do with juxtaposition. I read that you've talked about taking something from one world and mixing it with another, putting them together until something new happens.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of like usually 1 + 1 = 2, but in this instance, it equals 3.
Yeah.
Because a third thing happens.
So when you walk into a space for the first time, potential project, I mean, what are you actually looking for to kind of give you inspiration?
Well, I guess context is the first word I would use. The context of the space in a larger environment. Where is it? What's surrounding it? What's above and below it? What is it? What's its context? Where does it lie in history? And then it's what scale are we looking at? Is it how big, how small, how tall, how low, the volume? I'm interested in geometry and the plan. And the plan is the key thing to me is what's the plan of the space? Is it a boring rectangle? Has it got funny angles? What is it? There's an exercise called stripping back. You strip it right back to its bare bones to find out its history, what went before. Usually interiors go through a lifespan. They last for a certain period of time, then they become something else and become something else. So the history is of interest, and I like this idea of the thing called palimpsest, where you scrape away and you find something behind it, and it reveals something else and something else. And you maybe want to work with what you find. You maybe want to get rid of what you find. It's about editing. And then, of course, there's the client's brief, which you lay that on top of the kind of context that you've discovered. And I've always thought that it doesn't really matter what the host space is or was. I think you could do something great with pretty much any space from anywhere. It doesn't really matter. You take it for what it is, and your client has decided they want to put something else, something new in it, and you have to work with that. And then I bring it back to context, who's it for? What's it for? What's been before? What's around it? Where does it live? Where does it lie? What's its history?
So let's take one particular example, a past project, former yacht showroom, Manchester. The Hacienda brief, essentially, seemed quite straightforward on paper, maybe. A big bar, small bar, food, stage, dance floor, balcony, cocktail bar in the basement. But what came out the other end was something that nobody had seen before. How much of that was the brief and how much was driven by you?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. But what I would say is that the best thing about the given situation that I inherited was that the client group, Factory Records, etc., had never commissioned a nightclub before, and I'd never designed a nightclub before. So naivety played a huge part. And I think that was part of its strength, that nobody was carrying any baggage or preconceptions. What is it? Is it a bird? Is it a plane? It's a hybrid. That's how I saw it. It's a host space that needs to be flexible and allow for change over time. So yes, it needs a bar, it needs a stage, it needs a dance floor, it needs some toilets, all of the kind of practical things that make up a nightclub environment. And that whole yachting showroom thing is really a bit of a red herring, I think. It happened to have had that function some years earlier. It sat empty for a period of time. But before the yachting showroom, I'm sure it was a Victorian warehouse where some kind of industry took place, or storage or something else. So it was a large, huge, empty volume of space, which I describe as being cathedral-like. And Tony Wilson, God bless him, said that every city needs its cathedral, be it a religious space or a not religious space. So, I mean, basically, they gave me a tour around the space, looked at me and said, "Do you want the job?" I said, "Of course I want the bloody job." And it was like, well, get on with it, more or less. But what I think is interesting is that because of the relationship that I had with Peter Saville over a few years earlier to this, I understood more about the Factory Records ethos and the kind of free spirit that existed within that organization, and how, in fact, once they ask somebody to design something, they pretty much let you get on with it. And I knew all about Peter's work for the record sleeves for Factory and other labels and other bands that he'd worked with. But particularly with Factory, the mold had been broken, and any preconceptions about what a record sleeve could be or should be had been blown apart in a sense. And I kind of took that on board, and all of that was two-dimensional. I had something that's three-dimensional, so I thought, I'll just do a three-dimensional version in a sense. But it's a huge blank canvas. I kind of concluded eventually that what I'd kind of created was like a large piece of sculpture or a huge three-dimensional painting. But there were so many practical problems to solve, and it already had the sense of industry about it. So I was interested in industrial materials, hard-wearing, practical materials, whether they were flooring materials or whatever they might be. It had to be robust. So out of all of that stuff came something that where I applied colour you wouldn't normally see in a nightclub, materials you wouldn't normally see in a nightclub, but it still had to function as such. The lighting system ended up being more like a theatre lighting system where we had fly bars over the whole space that went up and down, or a pulley system where you could hang anything from this thing. You know, as time went on and as technology changed, you could embrace things. I always thought you could hang 18 dead sheep off one of these fly bars if you felt like it, or whatever. So it was about theatre. Of course, it came with its problems. You know, acoustics were awful in the space. It had a partly glass roof to it. You don't want daylight coming into a nightclub, but that was there. That's what I inherited. So it became a kind of a hybrid thing. The one thing I regret was forgetting about cloakroom. We didn't have a cloakroom, and we had to change another space into a cloakroom. The toilets, Tony Wilson said he hated my toilets. And apparently some of the punters used to go into the space because vandalism took place, and they smashed the ceramic toilets and shoved them down other toilets, and so we ended up having to put stainless steel toilets in there. And it evolved, and it was a learning process. And that was kind of exciting and interesting.
Did you ever imagine standing in that kind of former warehouse or yacht showroom, as it may have been at one point, that you were making something that would kind of end up as a historic England, one of the 100 places that tell the story of England?
Of course I didn't. However, what I would say is that mostly with the interiors that I have done, or my office has done, I like to try and build them to last. Interiors are temporary. They change over time, some quicker and some last longer. But I like to think that what we have designed with the Hacienda transcends fashion and can last a longer period of time. I think the other important thing to say, it was in Manchester. I don't know if it could have happened in London. I think it was important that it was in Manchester and that Factory were based in Manchester. And the weird, you know, the thing between Southerners and Northerners and the kind of proudness, the whole thing about Manchester and its sort of history. It was possible to do something in Manchester at that time you could probably not have done in London, weirdly, because Factory were based in Manchester. And Tony Wilson was an ex-Cambridge student, was obsessed with the Cold War spies because Rob Gretton was an awkward, difficult, extraordinary man, but managed Joy Division and New Order and somehow had a vision about things. And this kind of chemistry between these people was unbelievable. And the work that Peter had done, it was a kind of unique situation. And I was absolutely thrilled to become a part of that and was able to express myself through that, the chemistry of what that whole thing was.
I want to come back to something you just said there about building for longevity. We're so used to kind of spaces, brands, fashion being kind of so temporary now. But, you know, one of your projects, the Science Museum's media space, it's still standing decades on. You've talked about building things to last rather than chasing what's fashionable. Mm-hmm. In an industry that moves so fast, is that a hard position these days to hold?
I think so. Well, you mentioned media space. In fact, before media space at the Science Museum was the thing we did called the basement, which was for visiting parties of school children. And that's still there today, and it must be nearly 30 years ago since that was there. I was invited to pitch for the job, the basement at the Science Museum in London, a national institution, an important place where young people go and learn about science and education. And we were invited to pitch, we pitched and we got shortlisted. And when I did a pitch on the shortlist, we came out of that presentation, the then, I think it was the design director at the Science Museum, whispered in my ear, "Ben, wouldn't it be amazing if you got this job? You could do, quote unquote, a hacienda for kids." And that just resonated with me hugely. I thought, I have to get this job. I have to win this job. Because up to that point, all of the projects that we'd done and all the clients that I'd had were either friends, I call it wackos, weirdos, people on the fringe. This was a national institution. This was important because my ambition was to engage with the public and not just people who go to nightclubs or buy records or fashion. I wanted to kind of somehow allow the design language that I was developing to affect Joe Public, people in the street. And we worked night and day. I took more people on in the office to work on it, and we won the job. And the first thing that I did was paint some stripes on the columns in the basement of the Science Museum, as a kind of thank you back to the hacienda. And it's still there today. It's incredible. Fast forward to the last project that I've worked on in Preston in Lancashire for an organisation called Onside, who build buildings for young people aged 9 to 19. And they're like enlarged versions of what used to be called youth clubs. And these places up in the northwest of England are built in rundown towns where there's poverty, there's unemployment, drugs, gangs, problem areas. And they're big places, and they offer all the facilities that young people might want to use, like film studios, photography, music, big sports halls, makeup, cooking. And why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because that job came about because of the hacienda. So I've painted stripes in this environment, and I presented the scheme to the clients to start with, and the clients absolutely loved it, and they said, "That's fantastic, let's go ahead." They said, "But the only thing is, we now need to have to present it to the young people, to the kids who might use it." I wasn't at that presentation, but what happened was that the young people that they'd invited to present this scheme to thought, "Oh, this is a bit frightening, it's a bit scary, all these black and yellow stripes." And that was reported back to me. I said, "Look, all you got to do is tell them that I had designed a nightclub called the Hacienda, and somebody called Virgil Abloh had seen that job published, and he had been Kanye West's creative director. He'd started a fashion label called Off-White, fashionable streetwear, which has become a global label, Off-White. And as soon as they heard this and heard about Virgil Abloh and Off-White, they went crazy. Oh, it's fabulous. We love it. We love it." So it was kind of a fast forward moment, how this kind of language had shifted through time and geography and kind of cultural references. And that's just been published in the AJ magazine, that job. So it's still alive and kicking today.
Fantastic. And I wanted to touch a little bit on that collaboration with Virgil Abloh. So you collaborated on a project called Ruin at 180 The Strand, and that had remnants of broken dance floors, a bar resting on sand, scattered barriers, mirror ball over the wreckage. Where did the idea come from? And was it strange working with remnants of spaces like the ones you'd spent your career building?
Where do ideas come from? I don't know. Where did they come from? The amazing thing about the building that calls itself 180 The Strand, the man behind that endeavour, I'd known quite a long time previously, and I got involved with the building 180 The Strand early on when he was transforming it into this kind of, I don't know what to call it, an arts complex. I don't know what you call it.
It's an art space, isn't it?
Well, partly it is, but it's also got the space let out to creative people. There's so much going on there, it's unbelievable. But some of the spaces were a bit like the Hacienda. They were empty, cold spaces that had not been used in a long period of time. Some were leaking, but they were big, sort of industrial spaces, which I found exciting and interesting. And The project partly came out of a conversation between myself and Mark Wadwar, who is the man behind that whole enterprise. And I think I might have suggested that it would be great to do an installation in one of these basement spaces. I had this working relationship with Virgil, which Mark knew about. And the thing about the Hacienda is the legacy never stops. I say that the Hacienda never dies. It never goes away. It's still going one way or another. There are iterations of it happening all the time. And books are being written and stuff's being published and blah, blah, blah. And I'm subscribed to that ongoing thing myself. And I thought, well, when the Hacienda closed, it was demolished and a huge auction took place where they auctioned off all of the component parts of that building, from glazed bricks to stainless steel toilets to the steel columns to anything that could have been salvaged, the bloody chimney pots on the top of the building. A huge auction took place and people bought pretty much everything in the auction. Some years later, a guy decided to make a film about what happened to all the detritus from the auction, the remnants. And he made a film called Who Owns the Dance Floor, which is a fabulous piece of work. And I just love the idea of what happened to all this, what became of it all. And the idea of a kind of ruin sort of grew into this particular installation. What had the Hacienda kind of stopped functioning as a nightclub and became a ruin itself? What would that have been like? What would it have felt like? And, you know, Virgil had this huge interest in nightclubs and the whole language around popular culture into fashion. And it evolved. And it was the most fabulous kind of project to create. You're right, it was a weird experience. What the hell am I doing? Designing a ruin. I had to produce drawings for people to fabricate this thing from. And I remember being on site one day and a bit of what looked like it might have come from the Hacienda was lying on the floor. I said, can you smash it in half? I need to see it more broken. It needs to be more derelict, more broken. And then we were able to have a kind of a sort of a light show happening in there and some mist. So it became this kind of weird, it could still be functioning. And wouldn't that be amazing to have a nightclub that is a ruined nightclub, but it's still functioning? You know, and it made me think about Berlin and strange nightclubs that happened in Berlin that were sort of dark, dank spaces and not glamorous things like happened in Manhattan that were more kind of art spaces, not as nightclubs. So it was a statement, and Virgil's input was kind of more conceptual and not hands-on. But his name certainly was associated with it. And he came on the opening night and did a DJ slot. We had this kind of ruined DJ booth. Jarvis Cocker did a performance in there with Steve Mackey from Pulp, who sadly died. Bjork did a thing in there. So it became a host for kind of art events, if you like. And I loved it. It was just amazing. And it was cold in there. It was spooky.
I love that idea that it's almost like an archaeological find or something.
Exactly,
yeah, amazing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I wanted it to be. It had to be discovered, and then you had to kind of get permission to go in there because there were hazardous things happening in there.
I want to bring us up to date in a way and talk about a couple of things. So how you work now and also about some of your teaching as well. So you now work solo or in collaborations rather than running a full studio. What's better about working that way for you now? And what does it let you do that running an office didn't?
Well, because I don't run the office, I don't have a machine to feed. Well, the two ways that things can happen. If I get a smaller project, I employ freelance people as and when necessary. I have two studios. I've got one in London, which is a small place that I operate from, but I'm lucky to have a place down on the South Coast where I've got a bigger studio. And I never made the transition when everything went crazy with the digital world, and I don't draw on computer. And I've got an old-fashioned drawing machine down at this studio on the coast. I go down there and draw the basics of a design, whatever it is. on tracing paper with an adjustable set square and a parallel motion drawing. I take it to the art store in Rye who can scan things. They email them back to me, and I email those to a young person who then puts them on computer. So I love this transition from analog to digital through this design process. It's quite rewarding. Or if it's a bigger project, I will collaborate with a bigger practice. I mostly have worked with a company called Brinkworth, who are friends of mine, some of whom I taught as students at Kingston. They've gone on to be doing great work.
You mentioned there about teaching at Kingston and also the Royal College of Art and UAL. You've done that for a long time. What do you find yourself telling students now that you wish someone had told you back then?
Well, that's tricky because when you say back then, I assume you mean when I was a student.
Exactly.
Well, back then, it was an analog world to start with. The art schools back then had a magic about them, which is quite different today. And the world was different insofar as not everything had been branded. You didn't have chain stores like you have now, and high streets were all full of lots of little small independent outlets. And it's much more difficult now, I think, for young people and students. My mantra or message is about being independent. And that's how it has been for me and my kind of generation, that independent record labels allowed people creative freedom, whether it was bands and musicians or designers creating stuff. That's pretty tough these days. So, my message to students is, when they leave, is to find ways of being independent, which is incredibly difficult, I know. So I suppose I talk about an attitude, and the digital world is there in front of you, and it's screen-driven. And I'm interested in peripheral vision, knowing what's going on at either side and what's going on behind as well. So you have a kind of a more holistic understanding of the world around you and not what's straight in front of you, and be more perceptive about possibilities and learning about what is happening over there and not just what's in front of you. Kingston took my archive, and I'm hoping and trying to turn that into a learning tool about how I've approached work and how projects have come out of a process where you kind of plow your own furrow. You harness and develop your own language, your design language, or your handwriting. I call it handwriting. I don't like the word style. For me, the dilemma has always been the land between the art world and the design world, and I've tried to kind of straddle that boundary. A huge influence on me has been the work of Marcel Duchamp. I became obsessed with the work and the whole notion of the found object, or a ready-made, which is partly where the language of the Hacienda came from, in a sense, is looking to the world of industry where you find a new language that you can apply in a different context. And that whole thing about finding one material from one world and putting it in another world, so the simple thing of putting a urinal in an art exhibition in whenever that was, or a bottle rack, or whatever it was that Duchamp did with the ready-mades, then I think you can look to that approach in a new way, or in a world that exists now, and interpret it in a different way, to find another way of thinking about something. I did an album cover for Suggs, the singer out of Madness. It was a solo album that he did, and it occurred to me that Madness, in their early days, did a thing they called the nutty dance. There's a line of them, and they're all kind of, I can imagine a bit of ska music going on. And I suddenly thought, that's like Duchamp's painting a nude descending a staircase. We built a set in a studio of a staircase, and I got Suggs to come down this staircase with kind of frozen shots of him doing that kind of Madness nutty dance, but in a formal suit, descending the staircase. And it became a kind of kinetic thing. So it's about transition. It's about shifting something from one place to another, and finding new ways of doing things, and not just formulaic kind of, well, what color do we paint this?
We're coming to the close of the podcast now. We like to end with some quick fire questions. So I'll just say some words. Give me your first response and we'll take it from there.
Or I'll leave the room.
Or you can leave the room.
Yeah, go ahead.
Found or made?
Found.
Orange or everything else?
Orange.
Silly question, really. Punk or rave?
Punk.
Of course. Idea or material?
Both.
One space anywhere in the world you wish you'd designed?
It's a bar in Vienna, designed in, I think, about 1908, called the Kartner Bar, or the American Bar, by Adolf Loos. It's a tiny bar that is exactly the same today as it was in 1908. And you can only get about 10 or 12 people in it. But there is just something magical about it, and it's really hard to put a finger on what that magic is. And I've been fortunate enough to go there a few times.
I love Vienna. I'll have to check that out next time I go.
You must.
Built to last or built to provoke?
Both.
One word you'd ban from the interiors industry?
Style.
Good one. Bad brief or bad building, which is harder to fix?
Bad brief.
And last question. Finally, the Hacienda, designed today from scratch, what would you do differently?
I put in a cloakroom.
Maybe different toilets?
Different toilets. That's so horrible.
I'm sorry.
Well, I could talk for hours about what I might do differently, and I know that that's not how we're doing it. Interestingly, we've talked about the Project Ruin. On the one hand, I'd quite like to design a really tough, challenging, hard-edged, brutal interior that was so challenging that probably no one would ever go into it. That doesn't work. On the other hand, it would really have to be a design that took people to another place that they didn't know existed. That's my answer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben, for coming in today. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you.
Well, that's my pleasure. I appreciate having had the opportunity, and I feel as if I've rambled a lot.
No, not at all.
To check out Ben Kelly's portfolio, visit benkellydesign.com.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, rate us, and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It's produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan, and special thanks to Pixiu Podcasts in London. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, so take care.